This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for May 31st, 2022. And before I get into the update itself, I just want to do a real quick review on why Russia is in Ukraine in the first place and what it is trying to accomplish. Because if you listen to the Western media, you're going to get many different answers, none of them the truth. On February 24th, 2022, when Russia went into Ukraine, it was not starting a war. It was entering into the middle of an ongoing war. For the last 8 years, since 2014, after the US overthrew the elected government of Ukraine and installed a client regime in its place, an extremely anti-Russian client regime in its place, the government there waged war on anyone who refused to subordinate themselves to their unwarranted, illegal authority. Crimea held a referendum and joined the Russian Federation. And if you look at everyone within the pre-2014 borders of Ukraine who managed to escape this chaos and this violence, who managed to fare the best, it was Crimea, obviously. The Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics in the Donbas region, they did a similar process, but Ukraine refused to recognize it. They did not join the Russian Federation, so they did not have the explicit protection of the Russian Federation. And so there was an 8-year war that waged, killing thousands on both sides, including over 3,000 civilians. Now, this is what Russia is intervening to put an end to and to protect the Donbas region. People say, well, why didn't they try the diplomacy? They did for 8 years. There were 2 Minsk agreements, and Kiev abided by neither of them. And so that's where we find ourselves today. And there's a much larger issue of NATO encircling and encroaching upon Russia and the United States government itself, funding political subversion inside of Russia and in nations that are allies with Russia. Belarus, for example. And I've covered many times this video of the National Endowment for Democracy. It's a US government funded organization that in turn funds political sedition worldwide. They were caught admitting to being involved in regime change in Belarus. That's what they were trying to do right before this conflict started. Overthrow the government in Belarus, just like they did in Ukraine in 2014. So Russia is a nation under threat. It's also a nation under attack. Political subversion. There were 2 wars in Chechnya. Those were sponsored by the US. It was a proxy war inside of Russia's borders. So this is not something that Russian President Vladimir Putin is imagining. This is something that has played out for real all throughout the 21st century. And this is Russia finally pushing back to try to put an end to it. That's why Russia is in Ukraine. Now, what is Russia trying to do? Again, they're trying to protect the Donbas region. That is a stated goal of the Russian government, and also demilitarizing and denazifying. And I think we see all of that happening right before our eyes on the battlefield. And as a matter of fact, why don't we take a look at the battlefield? Let's look at the map. And this map that I'm going to show you is liveuamap.com. It is extremely pro-Ukrainian. It's basically a visualization of the Ukrainian General Staff's statements day to day. And even still, it doesn't look good for Ukraine. So this has already been updated. I was looking at this over the last 2 days, and there were all of these Ukrainian counteroffensives that were attempted. They were aimed at Kherson. This is a city that Russia took very early on in the conflict, and they have held it, and they've consolidated socio-political and economic control over it. And these offensives completely failed. They accomplished nothing. They were beaten back, and now they are over. Just like up in the northeast around Kharkov, this major offensive that we were told was ongoing, that has long since ended. It didn't even come close to threatening Russia's logistics, any logistical lines that were feeding into the efforts in the Donbas region, and it's been static ever since. Well, Russia has been pounding this area between the border with Russia and Kharkov city. They have been pounding this, where these Ukrainian forces filled in this attempted offensive. Now, the action is all happening in the Donbas region. This is the main focus of Russian forces. This is the primary objective. Everything else is secondary. We see this large cauldron here, and we see how these salients are forming and breaking it into smaller cauldrons. And right now, all of the focus is on Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. This is a city of over 100,000 people and another 95,000 people in Lysychansk. And Russian troops, even according to this very pro-Ukrainian map, you can see they are admitting that Russian forces are in the middle of this city. And we hear about Ukrainian forces fleeing. And there's only a few roads going through here, and all of them are under fire by Russian artillery. I had mentioned before that the city of Liman has fallen. Russia now has full control of that, and they are pushing towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which is a heavily populated urban area, a lot of transportation junctions and hubs, and it will be key to controlling the Donbas region. So not looking too good for Ukraine. They're losing. And they're losing so obviously now that the Western media, who had been telling us that Ukraine has been winning all of this time, they have seriously changed their tune. So let's just take a look at CNN here. These are just live updates. They're talking about the EU oil ban, cutting Russia's resources to feed its war machine. That is absurd. They will just sell the oil elsewhere, and eventually Europe is going to end up buying it second or third hand because they cannot operate without Russian energy. It's just a fact. It will take them years to be able to cut themselves off from that. Thousands of civilians caught in Severodonetsk crossfire in dire need of aid, refugee agency says. Now, that sounds bad, but that's because Ukraine refuses to evacuate these cities. They refuse to evacuate them, and they put all of their heavy weapons in and among the population, using them as human shields. And that's not the Kremlin saying that. That is the Washington Post saying that. I've pointed this article out many, many times before. Despite this headline, Russia has killed civilians in Ukraine. Kiev's defense tactics add to the danger. Well, their defense tactics are using the population as human shields. And it even says, if you go down here, it says down here, over the past month, Washington Post journalists have witnessed Ukrainian anti-tank rockets, anti-aircraft guns, and armored personnel carriers placed near apartment buildings. This is a representative from Human Rights Watch, of all places. The Ukrainian military has a responsibility under international law to remove their forces and equipment from civilian populated areas. And if that is not possible, to move civilians out of those areas. If they don't do that, that is a violation of the laws of war, because what they are doing is they are putting civilians at risk, because all that military equipment are legitimate targets. And here is footage from Severodonetsk. That is a Ukrainian tank that was hiding under an apartment building. And when it was destroyed, it's going to damage the apartment building. The Ukrainian government's responsibility to get them out of there. They knew Severodonetsk was next, and they refused to. They wanted to hide behind the people there. Here, part of Severodonetsk controlled by Russia, with troops moving towards downtown, and they got it in quotation marks, like it's not really happening. But who is their source? It's the Ukraine military. It's a Ukrainian military official. So even Ukraine is admitting that this is happening. Russia is focusing on establishing control over Severodonetsk, Ukraine military says. And this was just 2 hours, 55 minutes ago while I'm recording this. So you can see how it's developing very quickly. Russia is moving very quickly. They have been this entire month, about the midpoint of this month, things started moving very quickly. Once they broke through the heavy defense lines, Ukraine's heavy defense lines that they built up over the last 8 years, they've been maneuvering in depth past them and just really wreaking havoc. And once those lines are broken, the ability to defend against Russia is compromised, and it's a cascade effect where it becomes easier and easier for Russia to degrade those defenses, get past them, and eliminate the Ukrainian military, essentially. I want to show you some other articles. Here's this one from May 28th. Ukraine says troops may retreat from eastern region as Russia advances. So what's happening is thousands and thousands. It's hard to tell what the number actually is, but it's like 10,000 or more troops, and they really don't have the ability to evacuate now. They cannot retreat now because all of the roads are under artillery fire by Russia. But at one point they might have been able to retreat, but Kiev never gave them the order to do so. So they're going to essentially either surrender or they're going to fight to the death. This Reuters article, it says, Ukraine said on Friday its forces may need to retreat from their last pocket of resistance in Lugansk to avoid being captured by Russian troops pressing in advance in the east that has shifted the momentum of the 3-month-old war. No, it hasn't. It's forcing the Western media to shift their narrative. That's about it. This did not happen overnight. This was all in the making, and people who are being honest about what was going on in Ukraine told you this. And if you were listening to people telling you what was actually going on in Ukraine, none of this would be a surprise to you. The article also said Lugansk's governor, Sergei Gadai, now where is he? The whole of Lugansk is either under control or going to be soon under control by Russia. So who is this guy the governor of? I don't know. But he says Russian troops had entered Severodonetsk, the largest Donbas city still held by Ukraine, after trying to trap Ukrainian forces there for days. Gadai said 90% of the buildings in the town were damaged, and he also said, we will have enough strength and resources to defend ourselves. However, it is possible that in order not to be surrounded, we will have to retreat. Well, defending yourself includes not allowing yourself to be encircled. So if you're unable to prevent yourself from being encircled and you have to retreat, you don't actually have the strength to defend yourself. You are an inferior force being destroyed by a superior force. And these people talk like this because they're in denial. They are living in a fantasy world, and it's not just the governor, the governor of Lugansk. It's the military leadership in Ukraine, and it's the leadership in Kiev, and it's the Western leadership encouraging Ukraine to continue fighting. Fight to the last Ukrainian. Fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. That is what this is all about. They have no prospect of winning or even a stalemate. They are being destroyed systematically. And this has been going on for a long time. You're just hearing the Western media talk about this now, but every single Pentagon briefing that I have gone over for all of these updates, every single one of them, whoever is talking says Russia is making progress in the Donbas. They refer to it as slow and uneven, but it is progress nonetheless. And if Russia is making progress in the Donbas region, what is Ukraine doing? They're doing the opposite of making progress, which is losing. That's what you do in a war that you're not making any progress in. When someone is making progress against you, you are losing. Now, so obviously these rapid developments that are making it impossible for the West to cover this up any longer, because that's what they were doing this entire time. They were covering up Ukraine's weaknesses. They were projecting them onto Russia, and they were covering this up for as long as possible. That's not possible anymore, and you're starting to see panic. You're starting to see panic of many different kinds. The Duran, if you're not following the Duran, you should. It's on YouTube, it's on Rumble. They have a Telegram channel, which is really great. That's where I go to listen to most of their videos. And the link to the Duran will be in the video description below. I had been listening to Alex Christoforou talk about this Washington Post article that I'm going to show you next. This one. Ukrainian volunteer fighters in the East feel abandoned. They're just telling you how poorly trained they are, poorly equipped they are, poorly supported, both militarily and logistically, just how terrible their situation is overall. And I have been talking about this week in and week out. The Western media is covering it up, and even the Pentagon would pretend that, well, they're sending all of this equipment to them, so they're okay. They should be okay. Well, this Washington Post article, so Alex Christoforou does a very good video on that. Check the video description to watch it. and follow the Duran. They do a really good job, and they introduce you to a lot of very interesting experts as well. So the Washington Post article says Ukrainian leaders have projected and nurtured a public image of military invulnerability of their volunteer and professional forces triumphantly standing up to the Russian onslaught. Now, who did they do that with help from? The Western media and Western governments. The Washington Post article also says videos of assaults on Russian tanks or positions are posted daily on social media. Artists are creating patriotic posters, billboards, and t-shirts. The Postal Service even released stamps commemorating the sinking of a Russian warship in the Black Sea. Ukrainian forces have succeeded in thwarting Russian efforts to seize Kiev and Kharkov and have scored battlefield victories in the east. No, they haven't. No, they didn't. So again, this is the Washington Post in a very indirect way admitting complicity in lying to people this whole time, because none of that is true. Well, the Moskva sinking, we don't know how that sank. We have no idea. Ukraine says they sank it with an anti-ship missile. Russia says it caught on fire and ammunition exploded, and that's why it sank. And I have seen no evidence from either side. And so for me, I'm not going to make a decision on it. Both are possible. But beyond that, everything else is a lie. Ukraine did not defeat Russia around Kiev. Russia attempted to shock the government in Kiev into surrender in the first couple of days. And when that failed to materialize, there was a very low probability of that happening. And Russia knew that, which is why they prepared months and months of men, munitions, and machines along the border with Ukraine. That's why they're still able to fight very efficiently even to today after all of these months. Once that was over, after the first couple of days, it became a fixing operation. They were fixing Ukrainian forces around the capital. Everyone that was rushing to Ukraine to go help, all of these mercenaries and volunteers, they all went straight to Kiev. And they were all tied up there, fighting a very small force that had no way of even encircling Kiev, let alone taking it. And while that was going on, Russia was consolidating control over Kherson in the south, encircling and taking Mariupol, also in the south, the southeast, and shaping the battlefield in the Donbas region to accomplish what they're doing right now, encircling thousands, if not tens of thousands of Ukrainian forces, and preventing them from escaping and forcing them to either fight to the death or surrender. That's what Russia was doing. And as soon as all of that was in place, Russia announced that they were going to withdraw from Kiev, and then over the course of a week, they orderly withdrew from Kiev, from around Kiev, from Kiev all the way to Kharkov in the northeast. That's what actually happened. The Western media and also Western governments, they seize upon what happened around Kiev and depict it as a victory. And that is part of the propaganda. That is part of why people thought Ukraine was winning, when in fact they were not. So this is a lie that is now being exposed. I think it should be very clear that Ukraine didn't win anything. And a lot of these videos that you see of Ukraine blowing up a Russian tank, that is tactical. That is not strategic. And every single day in an ongoing conflict, there are going to be tactical successes and defeats on both sides. And if you're a very good propagandist, you're just going to show the enemy's defeat and none of your own. And if you're biased and you're just following one source or the other, then it'll look like, oh, those guys are really getting hammered. Every single day I see blown up Russian tanks. But you're not looking at the blown up Ukrainian tanks. And you're not counting them and noticing that there's way more Ukrainian tanks and soldiers perishing on the battlefield than Russian. What really matters is the strategic picture. If Russia said their goal was to secure the Donbas region, and now they are destroying all of Ukraine's forces in the Donbas region, that means strategically they are achieving one of their main goals, one of three main goals. So anyway, the Washington Post article continues, and they're talking about, I am assuming that they are Ukrainian volunteers. So they're Ukrainian, but they volunteered when the conflict started. They're talking about a man named Lapko and his group of volunteers Their experience offers a rare and more realistic portrait of the conflict and Ukraine's struggle to halt the Russian advance in parts of Donbas. Ukraine, like Russia, has provided scant information about deaths, injuries, or losses of military equipment. But after 3 months of war, this company of 120 men is down to 54. That's like 50% gone because of deaths, injuries, and desertions. So the Washington Post is, when you read this, read the whole article, they're admitting to the very poor quality of the troops. They got no training, they have no weapons, they have no ammunition, they're not properly equipped, they don't have proper body armor or protection, there's no logistical support, their morale is extremely low. Pretty much everything people had been saying about Ukraine's forces this entire time. And I remember doing a video at the beginning of May about the Canadian super soldier Wally, this expert sniper who went to Ukraine, and he was supposed to go there and kill 50 Russians a day with a sniper rifle, and yet ended up killing nobody. He spent the whole time first running around outside of Kiev from Russians, and then when Russia withdrew, they sent him to the Donbas region. By the time he got there, everyone around him was dying. He was trying to hunt a Russian tank with one of these US-made Javelin anti-tank missiles, and half of his team, two out of 4 guys, were killed by precision tank fire from over 4,000 meters away. So that the tank was finding them and killing them with precision fire before Wally could get into a good enough position to take it out with one of these Javelin missiles. He saw that, he watched half his team die, and he left Ukraine. And I said back at the beginning of May, that's what's going on in Ukraine. That's what the Western media is not telling you. Now the Western media is telling you. Now, of course, the West really wanted to somehow win this proxy war. I don't know if they really thought somehow they could pull this off, but desperation is setting in, and they're willing to try all sorts of things and send all kinds of weapons to Ukraine in the hopes that somehow it buys more time, or somehow it turns the tide. And again, they're talking now about trying to turn the tide for Ukraine, when this whole time they said they were winning. So why would you want to turn the tide for a nation that's winning, that you're supporting? Because they knew all along that they were losing. So just yesterday or today, the US is deciding on whether they're going to send these multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS. And the US has 2 of these. They have HIMARS, it's a wheeled vehicle, and they have the M270, which is a tracked vehicle. HIMARS, they have about 400. The US has 400 in their inventory that they can draw from and send Ukraine. Obviously, they're not going to send all 400, because then the US won't have any. They need them. And they have about 1,000 M270s that they could draw from. But again, they're tracked. And if you know anything about tracked vehicles, they're very hard to maintain, much harder to maintain than wheeled vehicles. They're also harder to move around. Yes, when they're on the battlefield, their mobility is greatly helped by those tracks, but they cannot go cross country. So you got to put them on a flatbed, or you put it on a train, and then that makes it a huge, very easy target for Russia to find and hit, even while it's on its way to the battlefield. There's another huge problem. There's a huge problem with all of these wonder weapons the US is sending. Javelins and Stingers, they might have some battlefield success, but they were way overhyped. And I'm going to get into them in a minute here. They were way overhyped, but at least those are small systems that are relatively easy to move across the battlefield. Once you have it, I mean, there are some maintenance issues that you have to keep up with, or it's not going to work. You know, like charge the battery. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. When you start talking about vehicles, artillery pieces, or this rocket system, it's very complex. You're talking about mechanics, electronics, computers. That's a lot of stuff that you got to make sure is working. A lot of moving parts that got to be working just right for it to be effective on the battlefield. Worse still is the logistical footprint of these MLRSs. Jacob Drazen, I've linked to other videos. I've referenced and linked to other videos of his. He did a really good job explaining about how Ukraine built up their defenses over the last 8 years and how Russia is breaching them. He also was talking about the logistics of these HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems, how impractical it is. And I want to get into that a little bit here. I want to show you this. This is from globalsecurity.org, and they're talking about an MLRS unit, the organizational structure of an MLRS unit. And they talk about a battalion, and they also talk about a battery, which is smaller. A battery is about 9 of these launchers. And you just think, well, can't they just send 9 launchers and then shoot at the Russians and make them go away? And the answer is no. In order for these 9 launchers to operate, they require all kinds of other support on the battlefield. Someone needs to go find targeting information. That means drones, scouts, something needs to go forward and find where the enemy is and relay that information back to the battery. Let's just talk about a battery, because I don't think they're going to be putting together a battalion. That will be a little too complicated. Once you see me go through a battery, you will see how more complicated a battalion will be. A battalion would have 3 batteries. So when you see how complicated just one battery is, then imagine timesing that by 3 and then having all sorts of other support required to make sure the batteries can all talk to each other and coordinate on the battlefield, because that's how they are used most effectively. And if you're not using them that way, then you're using them in a less than optimal way. And then what is the point? Because Ukraine had multiple launch rocket systems. They had them at the beginning of the conflict, and they lost them all, and that's why they're asking the US for more. And those were systems that Ukraine had trained on and used for years and years and years. They had all the logistics and infrastructure needed to service them, to get supplies out to them, to get them off the battlefield back to be repaired. They had all of that. Now they're going to have to start all over again with these HIMARS or the M270s, which would be even more difficult to deal with. So let's look at just one battery. One battery, in the US, when the US sets up a battery, it's got over 60 vehicles, over 50 for support, and 9 actual launchers. And even if you just want to talk about fuel and ammunition and the necessity of bringing that to the battery, these 9 vehicles, you need something like 15 trucks. A battery needs to have leadership. That is probably going to be an officer and also senior NCOs. You also have to have an ops center. That is an operations officer and 5 fire direction specialists. And they're the ones that are going to figure out where the battery is, where it needs to go, where the enemy is, and keep track of all the maps. That is very important. Or why do you have them? You're not just going to randomly shoot rockets downrange. If you want to actually hit something and make any sort of difference on the battlefield, you need to have these additional people. It's not just the people operating the launchers. You have to have a supply section. That means fuel and everything else that the crews of these 9 vehicles need to live day to day on the battlefield. Now, that's something that I think that Ukraine would already have for all of its other troops. But as we just heard from the Washington Post, they're not doing so good in that department. So how are they going to support something like this, something sophisticated like this? You need a maintenance section, because the first time it breaks down, that's the end of it, if you don't have someone to fix it. And that's not just the mechanical side, but it's also the electronics and the computers. Without that, you're not firing these rockets. And you need an ammunition platoon, and that requires 12 of these trucks carrying around additional ammunition, these rockets that the MLRSs shoot. And as Jacob Drazen said in his report, they go through rockets in mere seconds, and then they need more. And you need to have a constant, steady supply of them coming in. How are you going to do that? If you can't even get food and water and ammunition to guys with rifles, how are you going to replenish something like this, something sophisticated like this? And then you have the firing platoon itself, and those are the actual 9 vehicles that make up the battery. Now I got a little graphic that I made here, and this is bare bones. Okay, you have the 9 MLRSs. These are the HIMARS. This is a HIMARS battery. You need at least 2 fuel trucks, and you need at least 12 ammunition trucks to bring enough ammunition and fuel to keep these things operating on the battlefield. Just think about what this would look like out on the battlefield. That is a very large logistical footprint, but also a very large just physical footprint Russia is going to notice that. In order to stand up just a battery, the most basic unit, 9 launchers, you see how much is involved in that. And you see how it's not just training the crew for those HIMARS systems, it's everyone else that has to support them. You have to create all of the infrastructure to support them, or they're going to be useless on the battlefield. Now, I just said, if you're looking at this diagram, you see how many vehicles there are. Russia has drones flying around everywhere. They're going to notice that, and they're going to find it, and they're going to destroy it. And I talked about the M777 howitzers that the US sent, and in a previous video, I showed footage of Russia finding them, tracking them, targeting them, and attacking them. That was the M777s. Now there's other countries sending artillery to Ukraine because its own artillery is disappearing off the battlefield. So there were these Italian FH-70 howitzers, and Russia found those, and they struck those, a battery of those, and destroyed them. So that's what's going on with these heavy weapon systems. Russia has drones, they've got aviation, they've got artillery, they got counter battery radar that can find incoming rounds, trace it back to the system that fired them, and then direct artillery from the Russian side at that artillery and destroy it. And this is why Ukraine lost all of its artillery to begin with, and they're going to lose anything else that you send them because they cannot fix these fundamental problems, not logistically, not in terms of the disparity between them and the Russian military, the fact that Ukraine has no air power, essentially. All of this adds up in Russia's favor. And this is why Ukraine is losing the war. This is why sending HIMARS, no matter how many you send, the more you send, the worse it'll be for Ukraine. The bigger the logistical nightmare, the more cumbersome they will be on the battlefield. I said just the machines themselves have a lot of moving parts, but a battery has a lot of, figuratively speaking, has a lot of moving parts. And if they're not all moving in concert with one another, it will not be effective on the battlefield. Russia, their systems, they've trained with them for years and years. They know how to use them. They're going to outmatch you. And then even the smaller weapon systems like the Javelin and the Stinger, they have kind of reached the limit to how many they can send to Ukraine. And we saw it made no difference on the battlefield, and now they really can't send that many more. And now they're having a hard time figuring out how they're even going to replace them. Then I've shown this article before. CSIS, it's a US government-funded think tank, and they say, will the United States run out of Javelins before Russia runs out of tanks? And the short answer is yes, they will. This CSIS article says the delivery time for the Javelin anti-tank missile is 32 months. That is, once an order is placed, it'll take 32 months before a missile is delivered. This means that it will take about 3 or 4 years to replace the missiles that have been delivered so far. 3 years. The article also notes that the US buys about 1,000 a year. The maximum output of these factories is over 6,000, but it would take a year or more to ramp up to that level of production. And for the Stingers, it's the same story. So there's this Defense News article here. U.S. Army signs deal to backfill Stingers sent to Ukraine. The U.S. Army has awarded a $624.6 million contract to Raytheon Technologies to build Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to restock its own supply after sending roughly 1,400 Stingers to Ukraine to bolster the nation's defense against the Russian invasion. Work locations and funding will be determined with each order, with an estimated completion date of June 30th, 2026. And we're not even hearing about Javelins and Stingers anymore. We kept hearing about them at the beginning. They were going to be game changers. Ukraine was going to win the war with them. Then when it became clear that that wasn't the case, they moved on to the M777s. And now we're talking about HIMARS, M270s, Harpoon missiles, and none of that is going to make any difference at all either. Like I said about those Harpoon anti-ship missiles, the Russian Black Sea Fleet includes numerous submarines, which are underwater and the Harpoon missile can't hit. I have said this before and I'm going to say it again. Ukraine's only chance at reversing course, because otherwise they are definitely going to lose. They're losing right now as we speak. The only chance of Ukraine reversing course is if the US and NATO intervenes militarily, and that most likely will look like them entering into the west of Ukraine and creating a buffer zone between them and Russian forces without actually fighting Russia, and trying to preserve something of what we used to know as Ukraine. And I have said also that one of the things they might want to do is take Odessa before Russia does, because that will at least allow whatever is left of Ukraine to have access to the sea. It will be a perpetually failed state. It will not be economically viable, and it will be a burden to all of these friends and allies that put them up to this in the first place. So until next time, and then it might be a few days before I do another update, unless something happens, and then of course I will do a video on it right away. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find my work. If you're watching this on YouTube, try to follow my work on Odyssey or Rumble or Telegram, just in case YouTube deletes my channel. I've already been deleted off of Twitter for my coverage of the Ukraine crisis. In the video description below, you will also find all of the links that I referenced in this update, as well as for ways you can help support my work. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and through PayPal. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's month to month, one-time donations. If you want to do a one-time donation, many people have asked me this, you can do it through Buy Me a Coffee. I think that's the easiest way. And then PayPal also. Patreon is, I think, strictly month-to-month memberships. Thank you so much for that support. Also, if you're just helping share my articles or sending news tips or kind words, I appreciate that. That helps a lot. Also, I could not do this work without that support. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.